The fire in the great library of Castlevane Court had been built up past all reason for a March morning, and Elspeth understood why, before anyone said a word. A woman did not order coals heaped to the throat of a grate at 10 o'clock, unless she meant to burn something in it that the chimney of a smaller room would not swallow without complaint. The Dowager Duchess of Ravensby stood with her back to the long windows, a folded sheet of vellum in her gloved hand, and she did not look at the page as one looks at a thing one wishes to keep. She looked at it the way a careful woman looks at a debt. Elspeth had come only to return a book. She stood near the door, with the volume held against her plain grey gown, and she watched the dowager cross to the hearth, and she watched her drop the vellum onto the coals, as though it were a spent letter, the wax seal caught first. It softened, slumped, and ran red across the burning page like something alive, deciding at last to die, and the great green ribbon that had bound it curled black at the edges and was gone. The whole of it took less than the time required to cross the room. By the time the housekeeper's step sounded in the corridor, there was nothing in the grate but ash and the smell of scorched lambskin, and the dowager had already turned to the window and remarked that the gardens looked very bare this year. What the dowager did not know, because she had never once in 11 years troubled herself to learn the names of the men who carried her chair and held her doors, was that the document she had just destroyed had been read aloud, in full, twice, in the failing months of the old Duke's life, by a footman the household called only by his livery. He had read it because the Duke's eyes had gone, and a dying man trusts the voice. He had read it slowly, the way the Duke required, and he had a memory built like a strong-box, and he had forgotten nothing he had ever been asked to keep. His name was Jasper, and he was 29 years old, and on the morning the will burned he was 3 miles distant in the village of Penrith, buying blacking and candles, knowing nothing yet of what had been taken from a great many people in the space of a minute. The distance between a thing destroyed and a thing remembered is long, and it is walked slowly, and there is no other honest way to walk it. To understand what the dowager believed she had won, one must understand what Castlevane Court had been. It sat in a fold of the green country, some 40 miles from the sea, a long grey house of 2 wings, and a chapel, its park grazed by deer that no longer feared a gun, and for 3 generations it had belonged to a family whose head bore the courtesy of Duke, and the temperament of a parish clerk. The last of them, the old Duke, had been a widower who married late and buried his wife within the year and had no living child. He was a quiet man who had grown quieter as his sight dimmed, and in the last decade of his life, the person nearest to him was not his own blood at all. Elspeth Halsworth had come to the house at 19 as companion to the Duke's sister, a frail and clever old lady who liked her novels read in a particular cadence, and her shawls arranged in a particular way. The Halsworths had once held land of their own 2 counties off, a respectable acreage and a name spoken with regard. But Elspeth's father had stood surety for a friend who failed, and the surety had ruined him, and he had died leaving his only daughter a small black trunk, a miniature of her mother, and a quality of stillness that the world mistook for meekness. She was not meek. She was waiting. She had learned young that a woman with nothing must keep her own counsel until counsel was asked for, and she had kept it so long it had become the shape of her face. When the Duke's sister died, the household expected Elspeth to be turned out within the month, for that was the way of such places. Instead, the Duke sent for her. He was nearly blind by then, and he asked her, in his dry, careful voice, whether she could read a hand of business without weeping over it, and she said that she could, and he said that weeping had never yet paid a bill, or righted an entail, and that she might stay. So she stayed. She read his letters to him, and wrote his replies, and she learned the management of a great estate the way a person learns a language by living inside it. And the Duke, who had spent his life being deferred to by men who wanted things from him, found in her plain attention something he had not had in years, which was the company of a person who wanted nothing. To the county, she remained what she had always been. At the first assembly she attended after the old lady's death, a neighbor's wife had looked her over once, head to warn him, and turned to her daughter and said, not quite low enough, that the Duke kept a paid girl about the house and one ought not to wonder why. The room had decided she was a paid girl, and the room did not revise its decisions. Elspeth had heard it, and her hands had gone cold inside her gloves, and she had crossed the room with her chin level and asked the musicians for a particular air the Duke's sister had loved, and she had not given the woman the satisfaction of a flush. The cold stayed in her hands a long while after. The footman they called by his livery had been in the house nearly as long as she had, and for the first years they had been to each other only the two figures one passes 100 times in a corridor, and never truly sees. He was tall and spare and quiet, with a way of standing perfectly still against a wall that made guests forget he was a man at all and say things in front of him they would have died to have repeated. He never repeated them. He had black hair. He kept close cropped under the powder the great house still required of its men, and a long jaw that did not soften easily, and gray eyes that took in a room the way a clerk takes in a column of figures, missing nothing, totaling silently. The household thought him cold. The household was wrong. But the household was not often corrected. What none of them knew, because he had told no one, was that Jasper Renford had been born a gentleman's son. His father had held a small clean estate called Lindholt, hardly more than a good farm with a name, and had lost it to the same general weather of debt and bad harvest that had carried off so many lesser families in those years. The boy had been schooled enough to read law hands and keep accounts before the schooling stopped, and when there was nothing left, he had done the only thing a proud and penniless young man could do that was not soldiering, which was to take service in a house grand enough that no one in it would have known his father. He had not chosen Cassavane by accident. The old Duke had been his father's friend, the one man who had written kindly when the rest wrote nothing, and Jasper had come to him not as a charity, but as a servant, and had refused every soft place the Duke offered, because a man who has lost his name will not be seen to be living on the pity of those who kept theirs. The Duke had understood that, and had let him keep his pride, and had quietly made use of the one thing the boy could not hide, which was the strong-box of his mind. When the great man's eyes failed, it was Jasper he summoned to the library at night, on the pretext of mending the fire, to read aloud the letters and the ledgers, and at the last, the will. He read it twice. He read it the second time because the Duke had stopped him at a certain clause the first time and made him read it again, slowly, and had said, when it was done, that was it exactly. That was how it must stand, and had pressed his thin old hand once against the younger man's sleeve. 3 days later, the Duke was dead, and within the fortnight, the Dowager had arrived at Cassavane Court with 4 carriages, a great deal of black crape, and a son. The Dowager was the widow of the Duke's younger brother, and she had spent 30 years in the second chair of every room she entered. Watching the first chair belonged to other people, and she had decided long ago that her son would not endure what she had endured. Lord Corvin was a pleasant, indolent young man of 26, who gambled without joy and rode without skill, and would have been perfectly content with the modest competence his father had left him, had his mother permitted him to be content with anything. She did not. She had come to Cassavane to make her son its master, and she had the law of entails on her side as far as the land went, for the title and the great house must pass to the nearest male of the blood, and that was Corvin, and no will could alter it. The land was not all of it, however, and the Dowager knew that better than anyone. The old Duke had spent his quiet life converting what he could of the unentailed wealth into things a man may leave where he pleases, into funds and consols and the great untied sums that a careful widower with no child accumulates, and all of that had been disposed of in the will, and the disposition had not pleased her. She had learned its contents the way such people always learn things, through a frightened maid and a bought word from the solicitor's clerk, and what she had learned had sent her to the library on a too warm March morning with the coals built up to the throat of the grate. For the will left the great untied fortune, very nearly the whole of the loose money, away from Corvin altogether. It left a clean and generous portion to Elspeth Holdsworth, named in full. in recognition of faithful service and of a regard the Duke set down in words plainer than a Duke usually allowed himself. And it left the restoration of the small estate of Lindholt, bought back quietly through agents in the last 2 years of the Duke's life, to the son of his old friend, named in full Jasper Renford, on a single condition, written into the clause the dying man had been most careful about: that the 2 legatees should have the means and the standing to choose freely, beholden to no one, least of all to the family that would hold the title. The dowager had read all this in a clerk's nervous summary, and had understood it perfectly, and had understood, too, that an unwitnessed knowledge is no knowledge at all in the eye of the law. So she did this simple thing. She waited until the country attorney who held the signed original brought it to the house, as he was bound to do, and she received him with great courtesy. And she contrived in the half-hour his back was turned over a glass of the Duke's good sherry, to exchange the true document in his case for a sheet of blank vellum bound in the same green ribbon. And she carried the true one to the library and put it on the fire. And the attorney, Mr. Saffrey, a careful and honest man, went home not knowing that the case he locked that night held nothing but Ash's elder cousin, a blank. What she could not do, because she did not know it existed, was burn the copy that lived behind of Footman's gray eyes. He learned of the death of the will slowly, as everyone in the house learned things, through the housekeeper. Mrs. Tovey was a broad, calm woman who had buttered bread at Castlemaine for 40 years, and trusted almost no one, and she trusted Jasper. And a week after the burning she found him in the silver pantry and shut the door and told him low that the master's wishes had gone strange, that the attorney had stood in the morning room, white as his own cravat, and said the will in his case was no will at all, only blank skins, and that the dowager had been all sympathy and had produced from among the Duke's papers an earlier paper of her own discovery that gave everything to Lord Corvin, and that the lawyers in town were saying the blank in the case was proof the old man had revoked the rest and never replaced it, and that the earlier paper must stand. Mrs. Tovey said the name of the legatee in the burned will that the servants' hall had whispered, the Halsworth girl, and watched Jasper's face, and saw nothing, because there was nothing on it to see. His hands, though, had gone very still on the cloth he was folding, and that was a great deal. From him, he did not go to Elspeth. He had no standing to go to her, and he knew what the house would make of a footman, seeking out a gentlewoman, even a fallen one, with a tale that could not be proved. He went instead to think, which he did the way he did everything. Slowly, and to the end, he understood at once that the burned will and the blank in the case were the same act. He understood that the dowager had been clever, and that cleverness of that kind always leaves an edge somewhere. And he understood that he himself was the only edge, a single witness with a perfect and entirely unprovable memory, the worst sort of witness a court ever sees. And he understood one thing more, which sat in him heavier than the rest. The clause the Duke had labored over, the one that set the legatees at liberty and beholden to no one, had been written for Elspeth's sake and for his own, and if it died, she would be turned out into a world that had already decided what she was, and would not be argued out of it, and he would lose Lindholt a second time. And the old man's last clear wish would be as if it had never been. He did not at first mean to fall in love with her, and you may believe that, for it is true. What happened to him on the walk from the silver pantry to the chapel that evening was not a decision. It was a recognition. Outside that evening, the snow had begun. He saw her the next morning across the stable yard. She was standing in the thin gray light with the attorney's gig drawn up beside her, for Mr. Saffrey had asked to speak with her privately, kindness being the only thing he had left to offer, and Jasper, holding a horse he had no real cause to be holding, watched the lawyer tell her. He could not hear the words. He did not need them. He saw her receive the news, the way he had seen her receive the woman's remark at the assembly, with her chin level and her hands going still, and he saw the precise moment the cold reached her fingers, because she pressed them once against the side of her gown as though warming them on a stove that was not there. She did not weep. She thanked Mr. Saffrey for coming. She asked after his wife's chilblains, and then she walked back into the house that was no longer in any way hers, past a footman she did not glance at, and Jasper stood in the cold with the horse's breath smoking around him, and understood that he would have walked into the burning library after the will with his bare hands if doing so could have spared her the next minute of her life. He began the next day. He did not announce it. He worked by the only means available to a man in his place, which was patience, and the invisibility his livery gave him. He learned by standing very still in corners that the dowager had not done the thing alone, that the solicitor's clerk in town who had sold the will's contents had also been promised a place in Lord Corvin's establishment, and that Mr. Saffrey, the country attorney, who was honest, had not been told and was being quietly cut out of the business, and would soon be replaced by a town man who asked no questions. He learned that the earlier paper the dowager had produced was dated some 4 years back, and was witnessed by 2 persons, one her own woman, and one a groom, long since pensioned off to a cottage at Brookhaven, and he understood that a forged or coerced witness is a defense, an active thing, a wall built on purpose, and that no amount of remembering would pull it down by itself. He would need the wall's own stones to do that. And he learned slowly that the dowager guarded what she had made. She had not been careless. The blank vellum had been burned in its turn, the night after he heard the tale, in the small grate of her own dressing room where no servant but her own woman went. The forged earlier will was kept on her person, or locked, never left in a room. The pensioned groom at Brookhaven had been visited by her woman, and had come into a sudden small prosperity, a mended roof, a pig, and had grown frightened and would not speak to anyone. She had thought of everything. A clever, frightened, determined woman thinks of. She had thought of everything except a quantity she did not believe in, which was the loyalty a dead kind man inspires in the people he was kind to. The first stone came from Mrs. Tovey. The housekeeper who kept the household books and a great deal else remembered that the old Duke, in the careful blind last year of his life, had kept a letter book, a bound volume in which Elspeth wrote out fair copies of his more particular correspondence so that he might have them read back. And Mrs. Tovey remembered, because she remembered everything that passed through her pantry, that in that last winter the Duke had dictated a letter to his man of business in town, instructing him as to certain sums and certain names, a letter that rehearsed in its own dry way the very dispositions of the will. The letter book had not been thought of. It was not a will, and could not stand as one. It was, however, the Duke's settled intention, written months before any forged earlier paper claimed he had changed his mind, written in Elspeth's clear hand, and signed by the Duke himself at the foot of the copied page, the way he signed everything she wrote for him, so his blindness might never be made an excuse to alter his word. The letter book was in the library. The library was where the dowager now sat each evening, mistress in all but name, and she had begun, Mrs. Tovey said, to have the Duke's old papers brought to her and sorted, and a great many of them burned. It was only a question of time before the letter book went into the grate with the rest, and once it was gone, Jasper's memory would have nothing in the world to lean against, and the word of a dismissed footman against a duchess is not a contest, it is a joke. For he had been dismissed by then. The dowager, settling into her power, had begun to thin the household of the old Duke's people, the ones whose faces reminded her that the house had loved another master, and she had pointed at the tall, silent footman one morning and said she did not care for the look of him. And that had been enough. She gave him no character. A footman turned off without a character is a man who will not be hired again in any decent house, and she knew it, and she meant it, the way one steps on an ember, not because it threatens, but because it is tidy. Mrs. Tovey, white with a fury she could not show, reported to him what the dowager had said over her morning chocolate when the dismissal was done, that the house would be the cleaner for losing a cold servant and a paid girl together, and that sentiment had no rents and paid no wages. It was the third time the label had been hung on the woman he loved, and this time he was not in the room to hear it, only to be told of it, which was worse. Here the ledger stood, and it stood badly. The will was ash. The forgery had 2 witnesses and a date. The blank was burned. The frightened groom was bought. The honest attorney was being cut out. the one document that might have anchored the truth, sat nightly within reach of the hand that had burned its elder brother, and the only man who carried the truth entire had just been put out of the only house where it could be proved, with no character, in the snow 3 weeks before the matter was to be settled. For good in the county town, he had one night. Mrs. Tovey, who could come and go in her own house as she pleased, found him at the edge of the park where he had been told to be gone by morning, and she put into his cold hands the heavy letter book wrapped in sacking. Having taken it from the library that evening, under cover of the dusting, and replaced it on the shelf with another bound volume of the same color, so that its absence would not be marked for a day or two. It was, she said, the worst thing she had done in 40 years, and she would do it again tomorrow. She told him where Mr. Saffery lodged in the town. She told him to walk through the night, and be at the attorney's door before the town man arrived to take the business over. And then she did a thing she had not done since he was a young man newly come to the house. She took his face in her 2 floury hands and told him that the old master had loved him like the son he never had, and that she had not believed in any justice but God's for a long while, and that if there was to be any of the other kind, it would have to be him that carried it, and to mind the ice on the Pennorth Bridge. He did not walk through the night to the town. He had a better thought, and it was the thought that turned the whole matter, and it cost him the last thing he owned, which was the comfort of remaining unseen. He understood that a letter book and a footman's memory, brought to a town attorney's private parlor, would settle nothing. The dowager would deny, the lawyers would argue, the matter would sink into chancery for years, and a duchess can wait years, and a turned-off servant cannot. The truth had to be shown not in a parlor, but in the one place where the county's whole regard was gathered, and where a lie, once exposed before witnesses, cannot be quietly buried. It had to be shown at the reading. For the new town solicitor was to read the dowager's will to the assembled family and principal tenants, and the magistrate in the long gallery of Castlemaine Court itself in 9 days' time, that the county might see the succession settled, and lawful, and beyond dispute. The dowager had arranged this herself, as the final stone in her wall, a public ceremony to put the seal of the county's eyes on the thing. And Jasper, walking the frozen road to the town with the letter book against his chest, understood that she had built, with her own pride, the exact arena in which she could be undone. He went first to Mr. Saffery. He did not go as a suppliant. He laid the letter book on the honest attorney's table and opened it to the copied letter in Elspeth's clear hand, under the Duke's own signature. And then, with the lawyer reading along the page, he recited the burned will from memory, every clause, every name, every sum, in the cadence the Duke had required. And at the clause the old man had labored over, he slowed and gave it twice, and Mr. Saffery, who had drawn that will with his own hand and had grieved its loss as the failure of his life, sat back in his chair and put his hand over his mouth and said, when he could speak, that there was not a word out of place. Then the two of them, the gentleman in livery and the country attorney, sat through the short cold day and the long cold night, and built the only thing that could stand against a duchess, which was not the truth alone, for the truth alone is weak, but the truth braced on every side. They had the letter book in Elspeth's hand, and the Duke's signature settled in tension. Months before the forgery's date, Mr. Saffery had, against all his habit, kept his own original drawing notes for the will, the rough draft in his own hand from which the fair copy had been engrossed, dated in his office, beyond the dowager's reach, and that draft matched Jasper's recitation word for word. Loss. And there was the matter of the date itself, on the forged earlier paper which named as witness a groom pensioned to Brookhaven, when the estate's own wage books kept by Mrs. Tovey showed that on the very day the forged paper claimed to be signed, that groom had been 40 miles distant fetching a horse from the coast, a journey of 4 days there and back. Recorded and paid. A witness cannot sign in 2 counties at once. Here the road turned, and it turned on a single hard distinction. They could prove the dowager's paper false. They could not, by paper alone, prove the burned will true, for it was ash, and no court restores ash. They did not need the court to restore it. They needed only to break the forgery in public, and to lay beside its wreck the Duke's own settled hand, and to let the county, who had known and trusted the old man for 50 years, draw the one conclusion an honest room must draw. The law would follow where the county's eyes had already gone. The dowager had taught Jasper that, by making her theft a ceremony. In the days that remained, Elspeth had not been idle, though she did not yet know what was being built in the town. She had been given until quarter day to leave the house, and she had spent the time, as she spent all hard time, in usefulness, going quietly among the old Duke's tenants and the village poor of Penarth to set in order the small private charities the Duke had funded and that the new mistress meant to end. A man's true monument is not his tomb, but the people who do not go hungry because of him, and Elspeth meant to leave the accounts of his kindness clean before she went. It was on one of these errands at the door of a cottage where a weaver's widow lay ill, that the dismissive label was spoken over her for the second time, in the open street, by Lord Corvin himself, who had ridden out to look over what was now to be his. He drew up his horse and looked down at her with the easy contempt of a man repeating his mother's opinions, and said, loud enough for the 2 tenants beside her to hear, that he was glad to see the paid girl making herself useful for once, and that there would be no place for hired sentiment at Cassavon under the new order. The widow's son, a boy of 14, went red and clenched his fists, and Elspeth put her hand on his shoulder and held it there until he was still, and answered Lord Corvin, in a voice the whole street could hear and not one word of which could be called insolent, that she was glad to find his lordship taking such interest in the welfare of his tenants, and that the widow within would be most grateful for whatever his lordship chose to send. He had no answer to that. He rode on. The 2 tenants, though, looked at one another, and the thing they thought went out across the parish faster than any horse, which was that the paid girl had behaved like the lady, and the lord had behaved like the boy. She did not weep that night either. She sat in the small, cold room that had been hers and would not be hers much longer, and she took out the miniature of her mother and the one possession the Duke had pressed into her hand in his last clear hour, which was not money and not jewels, but a thing of no value to anyone but her. The little worn pocket testament he had carried his whole life and could no longer read, and she held them both, and she thought about going. She did not let herself think about the tall, silent footman who had been turned off in the snow, because she had no right to think about him, because thinking about him made the cold reach her hands, and she had work to do in the morning that required steady hands. What she did not know, sitting there, was that 3 miles off in a freezing parlor a man was reciting, for the 4th time that day, every word that named her, so that no one might ever again call her a paid girl and be believed. The day came. The long gallery of Cassavane Court had not held so many people since the old Duke's funeral. The magistrate was there, Sir Whitfield's successor on the bench, a stout fair man who took his duties seriously. The principal tenants were there in their best, ranged along the cold windows. The Dowager Duchess of Ravensby sat in the great carved chair at the gallery's head in deep and perfect black, her son beside her, and at a small table before them, the new town solicitor laid out his papers with the smooth confidence of a man being well paid to read a settled thing aloud. Elspeth had been told she need not attend, and had attended anyway, standing far back near the door in her grey gown, because she would not give the room the satisfaction of her absence, and because some part of her that she did not examine had needed to be in the house one last time. She did not see Jasper. He was not in the gallery. He was in the small anteroom beyond the far door with Mr. Saffery and the letter book and the wage books and the drawing notes waiting, in a plain dark coat that Mrs. Tovey had got for him from somewhere, the first coat he had worn in 11 years that was not a servant's. The solicitor read. He read the forged earlier will in his smooth town voice, all of it to Lord Corvin, the great house, the loose fortune, the consols, the whole. And he was approaching the formal recital of the witnesses, the final stone, when Mr. Saffery rose from among the tenants where he had quietly seated himself and begged the magistrate's pardon, and said that before the county set its hand to this succession there was evidence touching the validity of the instrument that an honest man could not in conscience withhold, and that he asked, as an officer of the law in this county, For 30 years. 10 minutes of the room's attention. The magistrate who knew Mr. Saffery and respected him granted it, over the dowager's sudden sharp objection that this was a settled matter, and no place for a discharged attorney's grievance. It was Mr. Saffery who laid out the wage books and showed that the groom named as witness had been 4 days' journey distant on the day the paper claimed his signature, and the magistrate himself examined the entry and the dates and grew very still. It was Mr. Saffery who laid beside the forged paper his own dated drawing notes for the true will and the Duke's letter book, in her clear copying hand, under the Duke's own signature. The settled intention set down months before the forgery claimed the old man had changed his mind. The room had begun to murmur, the low gathering sound of many people revising a thing they had thought decided. And then Mr. Saffery said that there was a witness to the true will's contents, a man who had read it aloud to the Duke in his blindness at the Duke's own command, and the dowager said, into the hush, with the first crack showing in her smooth black calm, that no servant's tale could stand against a written instrument, and that she would know the name of this witness. The far door opened, and Jasper came into the gallery in his plain dark coat, and crossed the long room under the eyes of every soul in the county, and the household servants ranged at the back drew their breath as one because they knew that face, and the gentry along the windows did not, and for the space of 3 steps, no one in that room could place him. The gentleman who walked like a servant, the servant dressed like a gentleman. He stopped before the magistrate. He did not look at the dowager. He gave his name in full, Jasper Renford, son of the late owner of Lindholt, and a small sound went through the older tenants who had known his father, and the dowager's gloved hand closed on the arm of the great chair, because she remembered now too late that there had been a footman she had turned off for the look of him. And she understood in that instant the single thing her cleverness had not weighed, that she had never learned his name. He recited the will. He recited it standing still in the center of the gallery in the cadence the dead Duke had required. Every clause, every sum, every name. And when he came to the clause about Elspeth Hollisworth, he said it plainly to the room, the portion, the regard, set down in the Duke's own plain words, and the room turned, as one body, to look at the grey woman standing far back by the door, and Elspeth felt the cold leave her hands for the first time in 11 years, not because she was warm, but because she was for the first time seen. He read the clause about Lindholt restored to the son of the Duke's old friend. And then he came to the clause the Duke had made him read twice, and he read it twice. And Mr. Saffery held up the drawing notes so the magistrate could follow the second reading, word against word on the page, and there was not a syllable out of place. And the magistrate looked from the notes to the man and back and set the papers down very gently, the way one sets down a thing one has decided to believe. The dowager made her defense, for she was not a woman to fall without a fight, and the niche of this world is honest enough to grant her that. She rose in her black and said that this was a conspiracy of discharged servants, that the footman had been turned off for cause and bore a grudge, that no man's memory was law, that the letter book proved nothing but a blind man's earlier whim, long since revoked. She spoke well. She had spoken her way out of tight rooms her whole life. She was answering the wrong question, though. She thought the question was whether the burned will could be proved, and it could not, and she had built her wall against exactly that. The question the room was now asking was a different one, the one she had not armed against, which was whether her own paper was a forgery, and on that question the wage book had already spoken, and a witness cannot sign in 2 counties at once, and no amount of speaking well could put that groom back in the room on the day she needed him. She saw it land. She saw the magistrate's face close against her, and her smooth sentences began, for the first time in her life, to come apart, to repeat, to fray at the ends. And she said, almost to herself, that it was not possible, that she had been so careful, and in saying it before the whole county, she said, the only thing she could not afford to say, which was that there had been a thing to be careful of. It was Lord Corvan who ended it, and this was the mercy in the story, the thing that kept it from being a mere triumph. The young man had sat through the whole of it going slowly pale, and at his mother's last unraveling words he stood, and the room braced for him to bluster, and instead he said, in a voice gone strange and quiet, that he had not known. He said it to the magistrate, and then he said it to the room, that he had believed the paper genuine, that his mother had told them the old man left it all to him, and he had been fool enough and idle enough to want it true, but that he would not stand on a forged thing, that he had rather have his own modest competence honestly than Casavan on a lie, and that the witness should be heard out, and the truth done. It was not a noble man's speech, it was an ordinary man's, a weak, pleasant man choosing, once in his life, the harder honest thing over the easy false one, and it was enough. The magistrate adjourned the reading. The dowager's forged will was set aside for the courts to formally void, which, in time, they did. And the long gallery emptied slowly into the cold afternoon, the county walking out into the snow with the particular hush of people who have watched a wrong corrected in front of their own eyes and will tell the story for 30 years and tell it true. Jasper did not go to Elspeth in the gallery. There were too many eyes, and he had spent 11 years learning the discipline of not being seen wanting anything. And a habit of 11 years is not put off in an afternoon. He went out into the park to the chapel garden where the old Duke lay under a new stone, and he stood there in his plain dark coat with the snow coming down soft and straight, and he did not know she had followed him until he heard her step on the gravel behind him. She had come out without a shawl. She stood a little apart, the way the world had taught them both to stand, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the snow gathered on the dark stone with the Duke's name on it. She said at last that she did not know how to thank a man for giving her back her name. He said, without turning, in the level, quiet voice, the household had always mistaken for coldness, that he had not given her anything, that the name had always been hers, and the room had only been wrong about it, and that being wrong was not the same as being right. She almost smiled. He turned then and looked at her, and the look held longer than any look had ever been permitted to hold between them. 11 years of corridors, and held doors and unspoken things gathered into one moment in a snowy garden. And he said her given name, Elspeth, deliberately, the way a man says a word he has carried in his mouth for years, and has only now been given leave to speak aloud. She heard it. As the marked event it was, the first time in 11 years anyone in that house had called her by her own name as though it belonged to her, and the cold did not so much as touch her hands. He told her then, plainly, what the will had given her. The clean, generous portion, the means to go anywhere in the world she chose, and owe nothing to anyone. And he told her what it had given him. Lindholt restored, his father's small, clean estate, a name and a hearth of his own again. And he told her the thing the Duke had written into the clause he had labored over so carefully, that the old man had wanted them both to choose freely, beholden to no one, that he had set them both at liberty on purpose so that whatever either of them chose next would be chosen, and not bought. And then, having laid her freedom in her hands, first having made certain she was free before he asked her anything, he did not make a speech. He said that he had loved her since a morning in the stable yard, when he had wanted to put his bare hands into a fire for her, and that he was a man with one small estate and a memory that would not let him forget a single thing, and that the one thing he most wished never to forget was the look of her face, if she would consent to let him spend his life beside it. He said it was the only question he had ever asked for himself in his whole life, and Elspeth Holsworth, who had been told for 11 years that she was nothing the county need trouble to name, who had kept her own counsel until counsel was asked for, looked at the man who had stood in the center of the county and given her back her name and asked nothing for it until he had first made her free, and she answered him. And her answer was, yes. They were married at Pevensham Church in the spring, when the bare trees of the park had gone green, and the deer had their fawns in the long grass, and it was a small wedding, the country attorney and the housekeeper, and the village of Penrith, and no grandeur at all. The dowager was not there. She had withdrawn to a dower house 2 counties off, displaced rather than destroyed, neither in prison nor in disgrace before the law, for Jasper had asked the magistrate that the matter go no further than the voiding of the paper, that there be no charge laid, the minimum sufficient, the wall pulled down and the thief left her liberty. because the old Duke had been a man who corrected and did not crush, and his godson would not begin a new life by becoming the thing he had defeated. Lord Corvin kept his own modest competence, and it was said grew steadier for having once done a hard right thing, and sent at Christmas a brace of birds to Lindholt with a short, awkward civil note, and the note was answered in kind. Mrs. Tovig came to keep house for them at Lindholt, and ruled it as she had ruled Cassavane, and said it was a far better house for being a smaller one. Mr. Safari drew up the new settlements himself, and would take no fee, and was made godfather in time to a black-haired, grey-eyed child who, his mother said with the nearest thing to mischief her grave face ever allowed, would no doubt remember everything and forget nothing, like his father. And on the first evening they sat together by their own fire in their own house, owing nothing to anyone. Elspeth took from the small black trunk the one thing she had carried out of Cassavane, the old Duke's worn pocket testament that he could no longer read and had pressed into her hand at the last, and she opened it. And in the front, do in a blind man's careful uneven hand, guided by a ruler, the old man had written months before he died the single line he had wanted her to find when he was gone, that the world had been wrong about her, that someone would one day be right. She read it aloud to Jasper by the firelight, slowly, in the cadence the Duke had loved, and her voice did not shake, and her hands were warm. If the long road this man walked, from a thing burned to a thing remembered, has stayed with you, I hope you will carry it a little further, and tell someone the part that moved you most. The fire burned low. Outside the snow had long since gone, and the spring rain came soft on the Lindholt fields, and the worn little book lay open on the table between them, and neither of them reached to close it. Kenda. They sat a while longer in the warm, quiet, the gentleman who had once been a footman, and the lady the world had called a paid girl, and outside in the wet dark, the small estate that had been lost and bought back and given, freely held them both, and did not let them go.